Yeah, thanks so much for the organizers for putting the paper on the program, despite maybe not calling the entire research initiative after this program. But as you can imagine, this is a great group for us to present, and I'm very much looking forward to the comments. So this is joint work with Fabian Eckert, who is, I think, here, and he'll be answering questions in the chat. So, especially for this audience, I don't need to linger on the fact that growth is usually not unbalanced, but comes with huge sectoral reallocation focuses. And so, there has been a large literature on this. Many people in this talk have contributed to this. And so, what Fabian and I want to do with this paper is trying to explore to what extent this process of structural change has particular spatial implications. And the type of spatial implication which we're thinking about is we want to understand questions like, if the structural transformation shifts resources away from agriculture, do people move out of rural regions? What happens to local growth in rural regions? What happens to inequality across space during the growth path? And so what we're going to do in this paper, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to build a quantitative theory of this process, which allows us to sort of quantify the strength of these forces and trying to put sort of a finger on which of the economic mechanisms in the theory are important to understand these spatial implications of the structural transformation. And for that, we're going to take a particular application. We're going to focus on the US. In particular, we're going to focus on what's sometimes called maybe the first industrial revolution in the US from 1880 to 1940. So, our setting will be kind of broadly construed for this decline of agriculture, which I think is very much kind of interesting for many poor countries today. So what do I want to do today in this talk? I want to show you two empirical facts which we think are really important to understand the spatial nature of growth in the US, and they will be basically at the heart of how we construct our theory. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory. I'm not going to have time to go to all the details, but I'm going to sort of highlight which of the main forces are most important. I'm going to go to the quantitative analysis. In particular, I'm going to discuss a little bit how we estimate the model and show you some counterfactuals, which are going to highlight which forces are important. And then I'm going to have to one slide to what extent maybe our results here carry some lessons for structural transformation today, meaning either poor countries today, which also experiences decline in agriculture, or maybe the second industrial revolution for rich countries today, where it's more about a shift from manufacturing to services. Okay, so let me start with the facts. So the first fact which I'm going to show you is trying to think about to what extent the spatial layer is going to help us to understand how the structural transformation takes place. And for that, I'm going to show you a very simple decomposition exercise. So I'm going to basically decompose the change in the aggregate agricultural employment share in the US over time into three components, right? So SAT, that's literally just the employment share in agriculture at time T in the US. And we can decompose this change into three components. The first component, which I'm going to call the local transformation component, is essentially asking if the population distribution across commuting zones in the US had been the same today or were kept constant since 1880, but only the agricultural employment share change, how much would that contribute to the aggregate agricultural decline? The second would be a spatial reallocation component, which asks if we keep the agricultural employment share constant across space, but just let the population evolve as it moves in the data, how much will that contribute to this agricultural decline? And second, the third would be this covariance component, which is going to be unimportant and it's going to be close to zero. So here's what this looks like in the data. So in the US, between 1880 and 1940, we see the massive decline in agricultural employment, essentially from half of the workforce to something like 20% 60 years later. When we measure this reallocation component, we find something which Fabian and I were first surprised to see, that component is kind of small. It's on the small side, right? So what this means is, if you just ask yourself how much of this agricultural decline is explained by the fact that people move from, say, Iowa to Chicago, from rural to urban regions, this is not going to be very important for the US in this time period. Au contraire, this local transformation component by which existing commuting zones, existing labor markets shifted their employment from agriculture to other sectors like manufacturing and services accounts for the bulk of the agricultural decline in the US. Another way of saying this is to simply look at the cross-sectional distribution of agricultural employment share across space. So this is what the agricultural distribution looks like in 1880. You see that basically a huge amount of commuting zones have almost all of their employment in in agricultural labor markets. There are some what we might call like urban or city areas, where even at that time period, 80% of people are out of agriculture. If you follow this distribution over time going forward as the US develops, you see this kind of very clear sort of leftward shift. This is 1900, this is 1920, this is 1940, whereby the structural transformation basically, rushes through the US land, and every or almost every commuting zone develops. So this is the first fact which we think is important, that structural change in the US as far as the spatial layer is concerned is really about the transformation of locations. Now, one interpretation to think about this is that this is maybe just a shift in labor demand, right? As the economy grows, as people get richer, they demand less agricultural goods, so labor has to leave the agricultural sector and leaves rural locations. So if this was the only side of the story, you would expect that rural wages would see lower wage growth, or sorry, it should be rural areas would see lower wage growth, that the rural counties would be the losers of the structural transformation. Well, in the US at this time, this is actually not what's going on. So what you see here is the average annualized wage growth between 1880 and 1900 by the deciles of the agricultural employment shares. So down here, these are kind of the cities or the county areas. Up here, the rural areas. And so, what you see at the exact same time period as these counties are sort of industrializing, they actually see faster growth. And so, this is something which you're going to see is going to put kind of very tight restrictions on how a model of spatial structural change should look like. So motivated by these two facts, let me just show you the theory. On the theory side, we're going to build this model by combining sort of elements out of the spatial trade literature with sort of elements of a macroeconomic model of structural change. On the technology side, we essentially have something like Krugman. Two sectors: agriculture is a single good produced with decreasing returns to scale. Manufacturing has, as a market as a whole, increasing returns to scale through variety entry. On the spatial side, we follow the work by Costas, Trapp, and many others. We have many locations that differ in the productivity, in the land endowment. They trade with each other. We, for this purpose of this presentation, we assume trade is free. And obviously labor mobility is going to be important. That's going to be subject to frictions, which we try to estimate. Now, the three main ingredients which make this model a model of spatial structural change is A, that we accommodate the structural transformation by allowing for non-homothetic preferences. These preferences also again have price effects. So it's going to be the traditional demand force of the structural transformation. Secondly, we're going to allow for something which we call technological catch-up, whereby backward locations might be catching up with the technological frontier. We're going to try to estimate to what extent this catch-up takes place, and you're going to see this will be important to think about this rural wage gradient, which I showed you. And finally, what's going to be very important is we're going to allow that skills might be imperfectly substitutable, meaning that it might be hard to move people from the agricultural to the non-agricultural sector. So how does this look like in the math? So on the technology side, there's really not much of an innovation relative to this kind of spatial literature. Agriculture is produced with a constant returns to scale with a fixed factor. So it's decreasing returns to scale in labor, has some land which varies across location. Non-agriculture is a CES variety over a whole bundle of goods. Each individual variety which is produced in a particular region uses local productivity and labor, and there's going to be a linear entry cost to create new varieties in each particular place which use local labor. Finally, there's going to be some local housing which is in fixed supply. This will be for us just basically a spatial dispersion force, right? So the thing which you're going to look out for is this ZRT. You can think about this as like regional productivity, right? Which shifts out both the production possibilities frontier in agriculture and in manufacturing. Preferences. So we're going to set up our paper using these non-homothetic preferences in this Pickle class. I'm not going to talk too much about this given the time, given only the 30 minutes of this presentation. So these Pickle preferences, they're defined with an indirect utility function. They imply sort of expenditure shares across goods, which are still relatively flexible, but still easy to handle. For our purposes, these Pickle preferences are going to be very valuable because they aggregate very nicely, even though they are non-Gorman preferences, and they can be embedded very nicely in this usual, let's call it taxonomy of spatial models. In particular, we're going to get nice equations for these spatial mobility decisions. We're going to get nice equations for the sectoral allocation, which I'm going to show you in a second. Now, the three main novel ingredients are, first, how do we model local productivity? So we follow kind of a big sort of macroeconomic literature, which thinks about maybe, you know, this was mostly done at the country level, which thinks about sort of backward countries kind of catching up to the technological frontier. But we're going to think about this at the regional dimension. So we're going to think about an aggregate technological frontier, the bar, which is, you know, grows at a constant rate, GZ. And then local productivity evolves according to this process, meaning local productivity also grows at this rate, G, but if you are behind this technological frontier, Z bar, you get an extra growth kick. And what does that mean? That means that regional growth is going to be unbalanced, in particular to the extent that a region is far behind the technological frontier. Think about this as a measure of backwardness. You're going to grow faster to the extent this lambda is positive, right? So we're going to try to estimate this lambda. And so you can think about lambda as kind of, you know, parameterizing the speed of this catch-up process. Secondly, sectoral relocation. So to think about sectoral relocation is literally just asking the question, you know, very, very related to what Marcus talked about yesterday. You know, how costly is it to move people from farms to factories in a particular location? Right? If labor is very homogeneous, you just take somebody from the farm, you put them to the factory, off you go. To the extent that the elasticity of substitution in labor supply is less than perfect, you are, you know, skills are going to, the average human capital in manufacturing is going to go down as we start moving more people from farms into factories. So we're going to model this with this usual kind of Roy and Frichet type methodology. And what comes out of this is that this aggregate labor supply function in a particular location is characterized by this important elasticity zeta. If zeta becomes very large, we'll converge into the case where there's homogeneous labor, wages are going to be equalized, and you can move people essentially frictionlessly from sector to sector. If zeta becomes small, you know, these human capital differences matter a lot, and these selection effect imply that the aggregate labor supply function is not very elastic. Zeta is going to be an important parameter we're going to find that zeta is actually going to be an important parameter for us. Finally, spatial reallocation. So, you know, I already advertised that this kind of Pickle machinery is going to work well with this usual discrete choice and idiosyncratic shock type models. So we're going to model spatial mobility exactly the same way. We're going to think about agents facing a discrete choice where they're going to maximize expected utility of showing up in a particular region. There's going to be this idiosyncratic shock UI, which is going to smooth out this labor supply function. Now, what this Pickle and this Frichet income structure kind of buys us, that this object here, this expected utility, is going to have a nice form. In particular, it's going to have a form which looks like this, which consists of two pieces. The second piece is the one which all of you know. This is something like real income and shows up in any spatial model. This is just the wage over the price index. This first piece here is the one which is novel and is due to these non-homotheticities. In particular, to the extent that people live in poor areas, that's when the indirect utility function has a faster slope. And that means you want to get a higher, that means that the indirect utility of income is going to be higher in these locations. What this implies is that if we add to this these Frichet spatial shocks, that we get, you know, moving probabilities, which look very much what you get in a usual model, except that these values kind of capture these non-homotheticity terms. This one is this agricultural expenditure share. And you can also see there, as we go through this growth process and agricultural expenditure shares go to a constant, to this Cobb-Douglas constant, you're going to basically exactly converge to your basic sort of spatial model, whereby moving probabilities only are a function of real income difference. The important parameter for us is this epsilon, right? This labor supply elasticity. If epsilon is very high, then people are very reactive to wage changes. They're going to move out quickly out of rural areas and say, move to Chicago, move to New York. If epsilon is very low, this reallocation process is not very direct, and it's going to take a long time for the structural transformation to sort of direct people out of rural areas. Now, let me show you two equilibrium implications of this model, which I think are important to understand the mechanics of it. First is, what's the equilibrium manufacturing wage? Now, this combination of free entry into new varieties and this gravity structure of trade is going to imply that the real wage in manufacturing in a location is constant. Meaning it's only a deterministic function of regional productivity. It's like as if you have constant returns to scale in manufacturing. That's an implication of variety creation. So why is this important? It's It's important because that's sort of a sense in which our model has that, let's call it sort of Lewis type feature, where you have that one sector in each region which basically can kind of grow out at constant returns to scale, and moving people from agriculture into manufacturing does not necessarily lead to a decline in skill prices in the manufacturing sector. The second implication is that the model has very tight predictions on what agricultural specialization looks like. In particular, if you combine labor demand for agricultural workers with labor supply of agricultural workers, you're going to get a simple solution for these agricultural employment shares, which importantly depend on two endogenous variables. They depend on population density and they depend on income, right? And so that basically tells you, well, this model, and it's related to what we discussed yesterday, to the extent that land is a fixed factor, dense and rich locations have low agricultural shares because they have a comparative advantage in focusing on manufacturing productivity. Importantly, the elasticity with respect with how this is governed depends on both the decreasing returns to scale in agriculture, alpha, and the selection effect, zeta. Now, so as a last benchmark, I want you to think about sort of a benchmark of what the structural transformation looks like. We're going to call this the balanced growth benchmark, or sometimes we also call it the spaceless limit. So think about a special case of the model, which I think is as close to the basic macro model as you can make it. There's free mobility across space, so utility is equalized. There's homogeneous labor. There's only raw labor going back from agriculture to manufacturing, and there's going to be no catch-up growth. Lambda is 0, so relative productivity is constant. So we show in the paper what this implies is that labor, or the equilibrium distribution of work, is only a function of real wages and this kind of fixed housing supply. Homogeneous labor implies that the earnings is equal to the manufacturing wage is equal to the agricultural wage, because skill prices have to equalize when labor is homogeneous. So that implies that wages are actually just a deterministic function of local productivity. And if there's no catch-up, that means that the productivity distribution across space is going to remain constant over time. And so this has kind of some striking implications on how the spatial patterns of the structural transformation should look like. In particular, when you put these three things together, you're going to get that this model is a model where you have exact balanced growth across space. There's going to be structural change in the aggregate, where labor moves out of agriculture into manufacturing, where incomes grows, but all the spatial distributions are stationary. Particular, the relative employment is only a function of productivity in housing. Wages only affect productivity gains. Regional agricultural shares are going to be constant and dependent on productivity and endowments. So what I want to highlight is this is a model where mobility is free, but nobody's moving, even though the economy moves out of agriculture. So this is not an economy where you would think people move to Chicago. No, mobility is free, but it's a model where there's only local change. And I think the main reason is, the structural transformation is about moving people across sectors, not across space. So this spatial reallocation only occurs if it kind of supports the sectoral reallocation. But to the extent that it does not, and in particular, if labor is homogeneous, there's no need to move people across space. The entire distribution of population is stationary. Now, so what happens now if sectoral relocation is difficult? If this sectoral relocation is not, if labor is not homogeneous, then we can show in the paper that this observable agricultural expenditure share determines regional heterogeneity fully. Think about this as a way of like Bartic exposure, that the high rural locations are going to be more exposed to the structural transformation. And so we can solve out how local growth should look like as the economy moves through this aggregate trend. And this is what this looks like. On the left-hand side, we plot what we call industrialization, the change in the regional agricultural employment share as a function of the initial agricultural employment share. In the right column here, I have regional earnings growth. So if zeta is low, you would see what you would maybe expect. As the economy moves out of agriculture, cities, which are not reliant on agriculture, do better because demand shifts towards their comparative advantage, and you should see faster wage growth in cities. And in fact, those cities, let's call it, they should deindustrialize faster than rural areas. Now, if you make zeta large, and I showed you this kind of limit earlier on, this schedule becomes very flat. right? If zeta becomes very large, then actually earnings growth is basically flat as a function of initial urbanization or initial agricultural specialization. The same for this deindustrialization. What this shows you is this idea of this urban bias, whereby some locations are going to be the natural winners of the structural transformations, really a symptom of limited sectoral substitution. If it's really hard to move people from agriculture into manufacturing within the location where they are, they move to the city. If it's very easy to do this because skills are fungible, nobody has to move to the city. Okay, so for the remaining couple of minutes, let me show you how we take this model quantitatively. So we estimate this model to a series of data, both at the macro level, at the micro level. On the macro level, we try to match some time series data on GDP per capita, on relative prices. We follow basically what Clea already highlighted in her talk, that we kind of take the initial allocations in 1880 as initial condition, which allows us to infer these kind of fixed endowments of land and initial productivity. And then the two important parameters which we bring to this table is this catch-up parameter lambda and the elasticity of substitutions zeta, which we try to match by indirect inference. In particular, we're going to kind of capture the relationship between initial agricultural employment shares and future wage growth, and initial agricultural employment shares and future deindustrialization into our theory. So, our model allows us to match these kind of regression evidence directly. This is how this looks like. The data is the dots. The red line here is sort of the model estimate, where we estimate this. We match this beta directly. So what you see in the data is, as I've shown you kind of earlier, there seems to be this negative trend that why, urban places or low agricultural places seem to industrialize faster. And as you've seen already, there seems to be not an urban bias going on in the US. If anything, wage growth is going to be faster in rural places. What does our model tell us? Our model tells us that lambda needs to be relatively large, that this catch-up force is going to be important. And it also implies that this zeta, this substitutability of skills, is also relatively large. I'm going to show you that 3.2 is actually a pretty sizable number for this kind of skill elasticity. Now, to sort of highlight which of these forces which are in the model are going to be important to explain the structural transformation, I'm going to now do three counterfactuals. To ask how important are spatial frictions, I'm going to show you an equilibrium of the model where we take epsilon to infinity and these moving costs to 0. To show you technological catch-up, I'm going to set lambda to 0 and recalculate the model and show you what happens. And to think about the importance of the substitutability of skills, we're going to take this zeta close to 1, so we make skills very sector specific. So here's what this looks like for the aggregates. So what this shows you is the agricultural employment share. The black line here is kind of the benchmark in these three scenarios. So the first thing which you're going to highlight is that this free mobility is really going to be the spatial friction are not going to be very important. So if there was free mobility, if there had been free mobility in the US, as estimated from our model, the agricultural employment share in the aggregate would have essentially been the same. What's really important is this catch-up, right? So this catch-up force here explains in our estimation a large chunk of this aggregate decline in the aggregate employment share, and this reflects two things. First, in our model, lambda, or this catch-up growth, is going to be a big part of aggregate growth. And aggregate growth makes people richer, and so that, through this normomotheticity, reduces the agricultural employment share. Secondly, precisely because backward locations are in our estimations rural, it's precisely this catch-up which allows these regions to industrialize. And so once we switch off this catch-up, those rural regions don't industrialize, and the agricultural employment share don't fall very much. Finally, on the substitutability, you see this is less important than the catch-up for the aggregates, but it has some quantitative bite, that if skills had been less substitutable, the agricultural employment share would have actually been smaller than it is. And I'm going to show you in a second why this is. The intuition is that, these substitutable skills, they keep people in the rural areas. If skills had been less substitutable, more people would have moved to Chicago and New York, and the agricultural employment share would have been lower. So what about the urban allocations? So these are the implications for this wage growth moment, right? Again, the free mobility is basically the same as the benchmark, just because migration frictions can't really explain why rural regions see faster wage growth. What's really important are these substitutable skills. if skills had been less substitutable than they were, if this data had been close to 1, we would have seen that wages had been falling in rural areas, precisely as I showed you above in these analytical statements, whereby this urban bias emerges to account for frictions to reallocation across sectors. Second, the catch-up does what it's supposed to do, right? Without catch-up, this urban gradient would be, this looks like a 0. It's not quite a 0, but without this catch-up, the urban gradient would be far lower. So this catch-up is an important reason why urban rural regions grow faster. Now, the last thing which I want to show you today is to think about, what does this tell us about structural transformation today? And so, a crucial difference between the structural transformation around 1900 relative to what we have today is that we think that most employment doesn't move to manufacturing anymore, it moves towards services. And this is true both in rich countries from manufacturing and in fact in poor countries where the big flow seems to be from agriculture to services, not towards manufacturing. Now, if you think about sort of the basic mechanism of this model, you might think the two differences between manufacturing and services as sort of a destination for labor might be that skills might be more specific, right? Maybe substitutability is easier from somebody putting him or her from the farm to, perfect. Thanks, Paula. From the farm to the factory instead of a service job. Secondly, you might think that in the service sector, technology is more important to people, is more rival, so it can't diffuse very much. So if you think our model and you set sigma as zeta close to 1 and lambda equal to 0, you exactly would find that this structural change or this urban bias of the structural transformation might have been different. And so that's why we think that today structural change might be much more pro-city than in the past. And that might be a reflection of the fact or the fact that we see these huge spurs in urbanization today, whereby big cities are much bigger than they were when those countries than they were when in the US at the time, might be a reflection of this fact. So just to wrap up. So our story for the spatial structural transformation in the US is relatively simple. Growth combined with non-homotheticities implies that there's a dwindling demand for rural products. Now, somehow these rural places in the US did not empty out, but they industrialized. So could they do that? Our model kind of highlights kind of two main economic forces. A, skills were relatively substitutable. You could kind of, increase the manufacturing workforce quickly. Second, rural places benefit from technological catch-up. We think that today's structural transformation might be qualitatively different. I'm going to put two questions here. Is it? We don't know. Fabian and I, we looked at some data from developing countries, but we really didn't do this in kind of much detail. I think it would be fascinating to find out whether these spatial patterns are the same today than they used to be 100 years ago. And if they are qualitatively different, I think this opens up a big opportunity for a group like this to ask, what are appropriate place-based policies so that rural locations can keep benefiting from growth as they apparently did in the past, but they might no longer do that today. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Very, super interesting paper. So I have, I'll start with a question. So something that is not entirely clear to me about the mechanism is that, so I was wondering whether you assume that trade costs are equal to 0. Is that the case?
Yeah, we do that.
So in that case, there are no Krugman forces, right? Because for Krugman forces, you need trade costs to be positive, right? So because you were saying that you were using the Krugman 1991 framework, but here it's key that you have trade costs. So denser places have a comparative advantage in manufacturing because they save on these trade costs.
Right.
But in the model you have 0 trade costs both for agriculture and manufacturing, so you don't have that mechanism.
We don't have that mechanism of having a comparative advantage in manufacturing. What we do have though is, because agriculture is decreasing in terms of scale, if you have 2 locations and you just double the size of one location in terms of its people, it's going to have a higher share of its workforce in the manufacturing sector simply because, the manufacturing sector as a whole is kind of linear and you have that curvature on the agriculture. So in that sense, density has that, feature which is kind of pro-manufacturing. But I agree with you. It's not like the Krugman force because of the trade cost.
I see, I see. And then, you know, the second question related to that is that if trade costs are zero, why do you have demand effects? No, because I mean, if trade costs are zero and, you know, people become richer and they have non-homothetic preferences, so they have a higher relative demand for manufacturing goods, they can import those goods. And so that's not a force for local structural transformation. So this is the other, you know, second thing that I don't fully understand.
I would need to think about that a little more. Fabian, if you have an answer, feel free to chime in. I don't think we, yeah, I think I agree with you that we don't have a sense of kind of a local, you know, a specific local demand pull, in the sense that, you know, if you get richer in New York, that, you know, you tend to buy New York goods because these are manufacturing intensive. I think this kind of demand force really for us operates at the aggregate level, in the sense that it also does in like a macro structural change model. In particular, you know, take the model which I showed you where, you know, free mobility, but not perfectly substitutable skills. So there the mechanism is, as the entire US gets richer, aggregate demand moves away from agriculture. So you need to spend, you know, the agricultural employment share has to decline. So how would that work? Either it could be that every location would decrease its agricultural employment share, but that's not that's not very efficient, because some places have already almost all of their people in agriculture. Some people have a comparative advantage in manufacturing. And that's when, you know, the equilibrium reallocates people from rural areas to cities. So that aggregate kind of demand force doesn't operate at the local level for given prices, but it's really a general equilibrium effect whereby people move across space if relative wages move.
However, if you were to assume that the US trades internationally agricultural and manufacturing goods, you wouldn't have that demand force at the aggregate level either. No? So I guess the question is whether,
that's right.
You know, at that time, you know, what's the share of output in manufacturing and in agriculture in the US that is traded, so that, you know, we think of this effect at the aggregate level taking place.
Good.
Or not.
I fully agree. I mean, on that force, we really rely on there being a relationship between local income, or the local income distribution, and the aggregate demand for these two sectors. I agree with that.
Thanks. Okay, so I think, you know, I think Fabian answered most of the questions in the chat, but we can open for more questions. Joe, you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I really like the paper and I really like the model. And I was thinking that the model, you have these sort of 3 parameters, and I guess they could be thought of as maybe identifying what are sort of like the frictions to mobility or to structural transformation and growth, and then sort of think about what, you know, to what extent these are policy amenable. I'm thinking about like how to take this model and apply it to today, a developing country today. And I guess I thought maybe that was the possibility. I mean, another thing you could think about is thinking about this as a benchmark. I don't think we really want to think of it 19th century US as being a frictionless economy, although it is in the way you've modeled it. But if these are sort of like representing some underlying frictions, I don't know, just that was my suggestion, and your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's exactly how, well, I'm going to say Fabian and I think about it, but again, Fabian, feel free to interrupt me if you don't feel spoken for. No, we very much think about these elasticities as sort of mapping to kind of different mechanisms or broader stories which we think about growth. Let me talk about lambda, for example, right? This convergence term of thinking about, you know, the frontier. I mean, you could interpret it narrowly, literally as, you know, knowledge diffusion, which I think would be fine to me. But the way we think about it, I think, is more, you know, to what extent is it easier to move the technology from urban to rural centers than moving the people from rural to urban centers. So if it's easy for, say, entrepreneurs to, you know, figure out how they do manufacturing production in Boston and then move to Iowa and open up a plant with the local technology, you know, that would be sort of lambda for us, and there would be a lambda positive because these places have more to learn. You know, I think equally reasonable in this context would be that this just reflects sort of a deeper difference in regional growth across space, whereby rural locations are going to be later kind of later added to, say, the network of trade or the network of banking, suddenly they become access to financial markets, etc. That would also be in our lambda. And I think you can say the same about the zeta and sort of the epsilon parameter. So yes, short answer, we're very much in favor of interpreting this very broadly.
Okay, is there other questions or comments? I think we are, yeah, Eric.
I can ask you a question? Okay.
Yes.
No, just I guess a comment. Fabian kind of responded already, but the reason I was asking, here the result seemed fairly sensitive to how big are the areas you consider. No, so the Otter et al. Commuting zones are enormous if you go back to 1880, right? Those are, no, and so then the fact that you find that it's mainly driven by change in agricultural like within region rather than shifting across, that might be very different if you had a more realistic commuting zone in 1880, which is basically just around the city. I
totally agree with you. So I think the smallest we did it for, we can do it for, is counties. So for counties, it looks very much the same quantitatively, and we show that in the paper. But I think obviously this depends on the geographical, on the granularity of the geographical space. If you were to ask me, would you want to do it in a smaller sense than counties? I would maybe say like a little bit, but I also wouldn't go kind of too small, because I think, what the model highlights is that what we consider a region is a region whereby labor is shared, whereby production technologies are sort of kind of homogeneous, and there is a sense in which the technologies there are different from sort of a different time index, different location index. So I wouldn't want to take this model to sort of zip codes where you would think that the reallocation component got to be everything, right? Because nobody works in his or her backyard. Because I think that would sort of go against like the main economic mechanism which you want to highlight. But I agree with you. I think the commuting zones are probably too large than what we might want to do empirically, and we can do it for counties equally well.
Yeah, I think just to add to that briefly, we did the initial decomposition for like the states, for the commuting zones, and for the counties. And you see that as you go more granular in terms of the region, you get, of course, that the local transformation component is lower, and relocation across space matters more. And so, once you go to the US level, it's all local transformation, right? And so in some sense, you can read the paper also as asking how local is structural, transformation, structural change. And the answer is, it's much more local than at least we thought initially. Even if you go to the commuting zone level, the vast majority of it happens within that and not across those units.
I should also say, this is also in the paper, we didn't put it on the slides, but sort of again answering to Eric's point. So we did the same analysis for urbanization. Forget about agricultural employment share. We did it for urbanization, and ask yourself, to what extent is this rise in urbanization driven by people moving from rural to urban counties versus how much of it is kind of urbanization within? And we find essentially kind of the very much the same pattern, that 90% of this increase in urbanization in the US is driven by rural non-urban counties having increasing their share of the urban population. So in that sense, I think what this paper kind of highlights is that there might be kind of enough productive opportunities even at a scale of a US county that most of the structural transformation which you need to go through at the country can be done within, and can be done within without having large wage losses in these regions if skills are relatively substitutable, and if there is an extent to which these regions can benefit from growth somewhere else in the economy. And as I highlighted, to what extent kind of these two preconditions are still satisfied today is, I think, sort of an important question going forward.